How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award-winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor and your host. In this episode, we're exploring the Genetic Counseling Board exam, its development, delivery, and resources available to test takers. We're joined by two people from the American Board of Genetic Counseling, known as ABGC, one of our many organizations with many letters. So ABGC. And so they are both from the board of directors. So we can learn directly from them, from the organization behind the board's exam. So we're giving you guys an insider look at boards. And so you guys can really have a good idea going into the boards if you guys are doing that soon. So who do we have here today? We have Angela Trepanier, who is a certified genetic counselor and the current president of ABGC. We also are joined by Heather Rich, who is the executive director at ABGC. And to give you guys a little bit of background, actually, Angela and I were just talking about this. When I was taking my board exam in 2020, so 4 years before recording this, I had on the president at the time of ABGC, Adam Buchanan, and I found it so helpful to learn about how the exam works before I took it. It was able to kind of dispel a lot of myths for me and also just make me a little bit less anxious just in terms of what to expect. For those that want to listen, that's episode 126. We'll link to that in the show notes, but a lot of the content is still relevant. I mean, Angela, you said you listened to it recently. If there's things that you want to update, certainly, this episode would be the time. And actually, at least the old ABGC website had this linked. So maybe we'll make sure that it's linked on the new ABGC website, including this episode. But anyway, I felt it would be helpful for listeners who are planning on taking boards this year and for their instructors to learn more about the changes to the boards, because there's been a lot of changes, troubleshooting issues that have happened just in the past year. So Heather and Angela, thank you so much for coming on and just diving into all this with me.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, glad to be here.
Definitely. So let's jump into it. So can you guys provide insight into just the process of the exam development for this genetic counseling board exam and like how the interview questions are created, just kind of from this high level? I don't know who wants to start us out today.
I can start us out, and it is a multi-pronged process. As you can imagine, it has to be when you're developing a high-stakes exam. We know how important this exam is to people who are practicing, want to practice as a genetic counselor. We take that our responsibility very seriously. We also know that a lot of states have licensure and that they use our exam as that standard for demonstrating competence in genetic counseling. So that's also part of what we're always considering in developing the exam. But the process starts with something called a content outline, and that is developed by something called a practice analysis or a job analysis, or some people call it competency profiling. And it's a process by which ABGC convenes a bunch of experts who have different years of experience, practice in different specialties, come from different backgrounds, including different areas of the country and different genetic counseling graduate programs. And we all get together, and I actually got to participate in this when we did our last practice analysis. And we sit down and we talk about what is it that genetic counselors need to know and what is it that they need to do, what tasks do they need to be able to do in their job. And that's considering all jobs that genetic counselors might have. And that's about a 2-day brainstorming session using lots of resources like our practice-based competencies, our scopes of practices at different state levels, all of those documents that we've all used in training and that we see are available to genetic counselors. We use that to come up with that list of tasks and knowledge statements. And then we take it to our members. We take it to certified genetic counselors. It becomes part of a survey. So it's very scientifically and psychometrically based to ask them, of this list of things that we came up with for this practice analysis of what genetic counselors are doing right now, which ones do you actually do and how often do you do them? And what do you need to know, and how often do you have to have that knowledge? And then based on how people respond to that, that helps us identify what are the things that people are currently using in terms of knowledge and tasks, and how can that help us then design the exam? And we also give people a chance to say, what are we missing? What are the things that you're doing that we haven't included, so that we can incorporate that into our exam as well. And then once all of that information is collected, our partners with our testing company, at the time it was PSI, they take a look at the data. They're the ones with the statistical expertise. And with that, they help us generate our content outline. And then we sit and we talk and we discuss again. We have another 2-day meeting, and we end up with a content outline that has domains and subdomains that cover the different knowledge that people need to know. And it's all back to tasks that people do. And that content outline is then what the exam is based on. So I think I'm going to stop there and see what questions you have.
Yeah, no, that's so helpful just to know that it is not a simple process, and there's so much that goes into this. And it's not just your fellow coworkers with the ABGC and your team there, but also just the genetic counseling field, and people that are in clinic, people that are working in industry, people that are in our training programs like you are, Angela, of your other role. So I think that's just so important, that it's not just a few people sitting together being like, this is what genetic counselors need to know. So I think that's really, really important. Heather, did you have anything to add to that?
No, Angie did a great job explaining the job analysis process. It is multifaceted. It's a 3-stage process. It's very time consuming, and it is a difficult thing for genetic counselors to sit through and do, to try to even judge themselves as to themselves taking part in the task force. As what do I do? How many times a day do I do this? How long do I think about this? It's a science. I don't think it's ever perfect. You get as much as you can. But I will say the due diligence in providing a group of SMEs or subject matter experts together to facilitate this conversation is probably one of the most important things that we do. Is when you're looking at the roster of who's invited, is getting representation from all aspects of the GC community as much as possible. And that's what really is the backbone of the process, with the excellent facilitation of our test development company as well.
And we did pay attention to making sure that we were including people from diverse backgrounds, knowing that there's always concerns about bias with the board exam. And so any task force, any committee that we have, we are always thinking about having great representation, just so that we can do whatever we can do to combat any biases that are just inherent to any kind of testing.
And that's something that a lot of people in our field were talking about, I think, with previous editions, or whatever the term is, of the exam, to be more respectful of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, JEDI. In what ways has ABGC adapted the exam, not only of who's involved with developing the exam, as you're talking about, but the other aspect of having questions that are incorporating this in a respectful way, but also things that genetic counselors do need to know that we should be tested on?
One of the things, and Adam briefly mentioned this in his talk in 2020, one of the things that we recently did, or a few years ago we did, was we worked with a group called Nonprofit HR, and we had them look at all of the questions in our exam bank to look for biases, because we can look at them as genetic counselors, but we might be missing something that somebody from an outside perspective could identify. And so they did that, and we felt like that was a really important way of starting to get a grip on whether there are biases we can detect. And that doesn't mean that there are also probably biases that none of us can detect, but try to at least ameliorate the ones that we can right up front. And so they did look at the whole bank of questions, and they identified a few. It wasn't a ton of questions that had some biases, and those are removed from our bank. But then they also looked at all of our processes and gave us some feedback on ways we can do things to also make the board exam more representative for all people who might be sitting for the exam. And we do know how important this is. We want everybody to have a fair chance at passing the board exam. We don't want one group of people to have an advantage over another. And so we take this very seriously. We have a DEIJ committee that is working on a lot of different efforts related to the exam. As I think you have heard, we are incorporating demographic questions for the first time. They are optional questions that candidates signing up for the exam can complete, but the only way we'll actually be able at some point, I mean, it's going to take us a while to assess whether some people have a less likelihood of passing than the exam than other people, and that there are some biases, is to start to collect demographic information. So we are trying to do everything we can do to assess what we're doing and how we're doing it, and eventually assess our exam itself once we have a big enough N to have some reasonable data, because we want it to be equitable, we want it to be fair, we want everybody to have an equal opportunity to pass the exam.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be able to collect that. And then at some point, as you said, being able to dive into that data and see if there's any correlations that should be addressed, of like negative correlations of, oh, people in this type of subgroup or something are less likely to pass, or, you know, something along those lines. And for people that were taking boards last year in 2023, there were issues that came up for some test takers. Could we explore some of these issues and just what you guys have done? Because there's been a lot of changes since then of just what I've learned from you guys, but also, you know, ABGC being, I view, very, very transparent in the communications of just with the open house you had that we'll link to, that you had in the fall of last year. But yeah, would love to just kind of explain some of those issues and then what you guys have done to prevent those issues in terms of the test takers from March of 2024 that already happened, and then also for the August test takers that are coming up later this summer.
Yes, we had started to recognize that we were having some issues with how the exam was being administered. So it wasn't the exam itself, but it was the administration. So when people were going to their testing sites, sometimes they were having problems with the exam not launching or their IDs not working, and it was related to our vendor at the time. And there also were problems where people had applied for accommodations and they'd been approved and then they weren't given at the test site. And those things can happen. And especially in the last couple of years, just with all of the flux with the pandemic and just changes in staffing at different places, some of those things we thought could just be, you know, a sequence or a consequence of that. But when they continued to happen, we realized we needed to make a change. And Heather, who also works with other accrediting organizations, was familiar with other organizations that might be able to help us better than our current exam, the group that we are working with. And so she brought to us a potential, a different partner, Prometric, that we ended up partnering with. And one of the reasons why we selected Prometric is that whereas our past testing vendor didn't have a lot of their own test sites, they were really contracting out with other organizations like H&R Blocks.
That's where I took mine. Yep.
Yeah, yes. And so those are businesses that are doing other business and then like renting out their space for exam taking. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. But Prometric has a lot of its own sites, or I think they're all their own sites. And because of that, they have control about what goes on there. And those are sites that are meant for test taking. And so they're professionals and that's their job. And so they know what to do and how to troubleshoot. So that was one of the reasons why we wanted to change. We wanted to make sure that when people went to their test site, that they had the exam experience they should be expected to have, given just the stress of taking the exam anyway. So that was one of the reasons. And then the other issues we had sometimes with remote proctoring, that can happen with any remote proctoring. It's just more difficult when you're at home taking an exam because you have to be aware of your computer's capabilities, and then you have to bring something in from outside and make sure that's working. And so all of those things together can make remote proctoring a little more difficult than going to a test site. But for some people, it's the best option. Even things like when you're at home, nobody can open the door to the room where you're taking the exam during the exam, or that exam is going to shut off because it has to be obviously very secure. So, but Prometric has really used really high quality equipment to provide that remote proctoring. So that was just another advantage of moving to that particular vendor. And I'm going to let Heather talk more about it because she was really the leader that made this change happen. And we are all very, really very, very pleased with it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to kind of jump in here. I did want to reiterate too to the listeners out there that we did look at multiple vendors. So we didn't just say, "Oh, this is the one." Heather said, "This is the one. This is the one." So we did do our due diligence. I just happen to have contacts in the industry, which is helpful to ABGC. So the biggest and most pronounced vendors are the ones that we contacted due to the nature of our exam. Especially with the licensure component. So we did do a big deep dive in everyone. So, and then we kind of came together as a board and talked about the pluses and minuses of each vendor. So Prometric was essentially chosen. They have been a fantastic partner so far for ABGC. They stood up an exam in a very quick time for us so that we can not mitigate any kind of extended delays for our candidates. But when it comes to the process and the delivery of exams, I happen to have personal experience with them as to not really experiencing those types of things. So I joke with the board a lot when I say we should hear silence. Like when the exam's going on, we shouldn't be getting emails. Like that's a good thing. Like, unfortunately, it's not something we've experienced in the last year, but I am so happy to be experiencing it now. I can say that the March exam administration for those candidates that came in was so close to perfect. You know, like
Amazing.
There's always going to be, like Angie said, there are things that happen in testing, and there are certain factors that you try to mitigate as much as you can. So we're not going to lie and say that in any kind of testing environment, something might not go right for an individual. But I will say that anybody who had an issue, whether it was, an exam didn't launch or their internet didn't work or something like that, we worked with them. We work with every candidate. We don't just we're not like a one and done and not going to like help candidates out. So we certainly do. And people had a great experience. So, obviously the ones that passed really had a great experience.
Very much so.
The ones that don't, I do always appreciate their feedback as well to figure out like how other than the exam content can I help you? Because the content is the content, So it has been a great experience, and it just proved to the board every time we have a window that they made the right decision. Our previous vendor was very, very, very good at many, many things. It's just you can't, the biggest thing to do is to deliver an exam and to give everyone the same opportunity to pass. So going to a test center and something happening should not be on someone's mind. They should be going to the test center. They're nervous enough. The nervousness shouldn't come in with, oh my gosh, is my exam going to launch? So that was one of the biggest things that we wanted to control. And also with going to Prometric, they own their test centers. ABGC is only utilizing their Prometric owned centers. So everyone will see the same setup, the same color of paint on the walls. Like it doesn't matter what center you go to. You can live in New York and vacation in California and test in California. It doesn't matter your home record. You can test anywhere that a Prometric test site is available. So those are the things that we wanted to try to help control. They also have, since it's their own staff, their own IT, their own support there. So like Angie had said, when you test at third-party testing sites, you lose a little bit of it. You may gain some demographic regions where you use these third-party centers, but you do lose something very, very important, which is a little bit more of the control and the quality of the staff and the delivery. So, yeah.
Heather, do you also want to talk a little bit about the practice exam and how we're able to utilize Prometric for that too?
Sure. So actually, I also, Kira, listened to Adam's his thing twice.
You did. I didn't give you credit for it. So you both listen. I have not listened to it since 2020. So you can tell me what I said.
So I did listen to his, and I am just so happy to kind of, because you guys hit on the practice exam. And there's there's so many key components, but there's one huge component that, while I understand it did cause some dissent, that the practice exam wasn't available for a while. We did have to go back and remap it back to the new content outline because there was a lot of questions in which were kind of missing from that content outline. So we did our due diligence. We worked with a separate committee wrote new items. So the practice exam launched on June 1, just a couple days ago.
In 2024, for people listening years later.
Yes.
2024. It has over it's 30 plus new items on this exam. It's completely mapped back to the content outline. It is 100 questions, so it's exactly one half of the live exam.
I think that's more. Was it 50 questions before when I was doing it in 2020? Maybe.
I think it might have been.
It sounds more. I probably shouldn't say because I can't remember, but it feels like more. That's good.
I'm happy to share that. So here's one of the biggest things for the practice exam. Number one, the content has been updated, which is great. It is going to be on a 2-year update cycle. So for those that are listening, if you purchase the practice exam now and you take it and you purchase it in 6 months, you're still purchasing the same exam. So, and that's okay.
Good to be transparent about. Yep.
The best part is that this exam is delivered on the same test driver that the practice exam is delivered on the same test driver that the exam is. So when I mean test driver, it means it is the same look and feel of the entire system. You will
it's the same application program that you're like launching and like the way you're viewing it.
Yep. You will go through the same practice, like here's how you go through, here's how you mark questions. You have all the same features. And then you also get a report at the end. We don't really call it a score report because, of course, this is low stakes. You're not actually getting a pass-fail. And it does also give you some general information on domain and subdomain level. It is slightly different from what you receive on the live exam because, of course, the live exam is scaled scored. So there's like a low, medium, high type thing. So, but it does give you some aspects to say, hey, maybe domain 4 is the one I didn't.
What are the different domains? Like, what do you mean by that? Like the different content areas?
Yes. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the beauty of the new practice exam is that not only is it going to give you practice on how to answer high stakes exam questions and what is the tone, what is the feel of the questions that you won't see the same exact questions, of course, because we wouldn't do that to anyone, but the way they're written is the way they're written by our item writers right now is the way that practice exam is written. So
same
it's giving
format. Yeah.
It's giving you the same like kind of look and feel. And it's also giving you what the driver looks like. So now you're not going into the exam blind saying, I have no idea what it's like. I'm not sure how to maneuver around the system. You get all of that aspect. So that is a definite improvement over the previous practice exams which were not housed on the same test driver. It was pretty much in just a separate system. That's just a practice exam system. So we're really happy about that, to be able to share that with the candidates and hoping that might ease a little bit of some anxiety. And we have several schools that have already purchased practice exams and they're getting ready to have their students take them. So I assume I'm going to get some feedback in the next couple of weeks. So
probably. Yeah, definitely. Now that graduations have happened and then people are starting to study, but they have to study. It's best to study a lot and then take the practice exam, in my opinion, as you get closer to really see, all right, what should you focus on for those last few weeks of studying? That's just my personal way that I studied. Angela, what are your thoughts?
I think that's usually the best approach, but people have different ways of approaching things. So some people want to know, like, what do I know already and go into it that way. But I agree. I usually like to wait until closer to the end so I can see, where are my weak areas and focus on those. And then Heather, there's a calculator now, right?
Yes, there's a calculator that is within. So the practice exam, there's a calculator on the live exam and the practice exam. So for the practice exam, obviously this is not in a browser that locks you down like as if you're remote proctoring. So it launches right into a web browser. You can use your scratch paper. We do allow scratch paper for remote proctoring and scratch paper for the live exam as well. So, those aspects are still there. I will do a disclaimer because I wouldn't be doing the board justice, is that one should not assume if you get 100% on the practice exam or 80% right that you are a shoo-in and stop study efforts for the live exam. So I want to reiterate that again, is that while I hope you do well on the practice exam, I don't want you to stop your study efforts to think that this is exactly what the live exam is going to have on it, because that would not be a direct correlation.
Right.
We can say that it does test the domains and subdomains of it, but those questions are not 100% like they're not a one-to-one match. So I just want
It's
to put that out.
indicative of how you'll do and kind of a preview and it's a marker, but it's not like, oh, if you got what equivalent of an A would be or something like, oh, I'm good, I'm gonna stop studying. Like if someone said that, I'd be like, oh gosh, honey, no, keep studying. Let's keep going. You could have gotten lucky on some questions that, oh, you saw a case in clinic and you remember how it went. Yeah.
That's what we just want people to continue to do. Well, I hope everyone who does well in the practice exam passes the CGC exam. Of course, that's what we want, but it would be without fail if we didn't kind of give that advice to everyone. So
yeah, and I did want to dive in a little bit deeper in terms of what kind of content is on the board's exam, because I think there's this misconception before people start learning about the exam and how it works and what's included, that people are like, oh, there's a prenatal section, there's a ped section. That's, from my understanding and recollection, that's not how it's set up. When you're talking about these different content areas, it's more like risk assessment and understanding different testing, and it's more categorized that way and not necessarily through specialties. Am I getting that right? Am I remembering it right?
I mean, there is specialty. You have to be familiar with different specialties because you might, and I don't ever get to see the exam questions, just as a disclaimer, because I'm a program director, so I never get to participate in that process.
That's a
so
good
I've
disclaimer to mention.
Yeah,
yes.
I have not seen an exam question since I took the exam, but in general, you will get questions related to certain specialties. So you might get a prenatal question, but oftentimes, depending on what type of question it is, if it's recall, which is just recalling basic facts, versus analysis or application, it might integrate something that you would need to know in a prenatal setting and apply it to the question at hand. So if it's a question about like triaging a genetic counseling case in a prenatal setting, you'd have to know like what week's gestation is the pregnant person so that we can decide whether or not to see them, now or in 5 weeks, and when can we do ultrasound, those types of things. So it does incorporate knowledge that you have to know from those different specialties, but there's not like, here's your prenatal section, here's all the prenatal questions. It's all integrated within the exam.
And I could add a little something too, which would be very helpful for the listeners as well, is that it's important to know too that, the CEC, which is the Certification Exam Committee, they're made up of almost 13 individuals now that have expertise across the board. So we make sure that in each area that we're looking for, we have someone on the committee who can speak and are the experts on that specific cancer area, prenatal, things like that. But I think what some people get frustrated, and these are the comments I hear from CGCs, and I hear this from all certification orgs, so this is not indicative to genetic counseling. So what happens is when the exam's developed, all the questions are randomized. Answers are randomized, questions are randomized. So some people get held up thinking, oh, there was so much prenatal on the exam. Well, not necessarily, but they may have gotten a series, maybe 2 prenatal questions in a row, and then 10 questions later, another prenatal question, which in your mind makes you think like this is all prenatal. And it's usually more indicative at the end of the exam because you remember like the last things you took usually is what you do. So the committee does an impressive job along with the test vendor to make sure that we don't have questions that cue off of each other, meaning one gives away the answer to another, and then ones that are not mirror images of each other. Because, as weird as it is, we have so many item writers. Sometimes item writers inadvertently write the same question, but they're like completely opposite because they have that thought process. So we make sure that we don't have any duplicate questions. We don't have any questions that are queuing. And we also make sure that we are not super high in prenatal, only testing cancer. Like we really try, we do our best, and the committee goes through this. They review the exam at least twice a year. So we recognize those things and we make sure that that's not happening. And also to kind of put in a little ditty too, is that 30 of the questions on each exam, those are pre-tests. So what that really means is you're not going to be scored on those and you won't know which ones those are. And we do that for specific reasons, is that if individuals know that they're pre-test items, you're less likely to answer them in the same manner and fashion that you would answer something that is for score. So, and those pretest items are super important for ABGC because those are the next set of items after we get enough statistics that roll into live items. And that's how we repurpose old items. Items age out, we take them out of the exam, or say there is I'm not a genetic counselor, so if there is a disease or something specific to genetic counseling that's no longer really applicative anymore, we phase that question out, we pull new ones in. So we're always gathering stats on items, and that's the most important thing, because that's how we're able to ensure that our exams have the equal weighted difficulty amongst each other. So that's really important. So there is a lot of science that goes behind these exams. So
I would hope so, right?
yeah, it's certainly not just three people in a room just writing questions and saying, here you go. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think we very much like have captured that aspect of it. And that with the content, as you said, it does change, and genetics changes so fast. So you need to have those questions ready to go, because there'll be questions about, say quad screening that, I don't know if that in prenatal realm of that's something that's being phased out, that in a couple years, maybe it's already off the exam. I don't know. You probably aren't at liberty to say. I have no idea clearly, but something like that, where it's like, all right, we should be phasing out that question because we're not really offering that, say 5 years from now or something. Not many places even offer it now. So I think things like that, but also adding in new areas where I've heard, which correct me if I'm wrong, that now there's going to be questions about insurance. I don't know if that applied to this past cycle in March or if that's just in August upcoming. Are there other newer areas that people should be aware of, and other program directors and things like you, Angela, to make sure that students are learning so that they are prepared for boards? Because I think when I was taking it 4 years ago, I don't remember if there was anything related to insurance. And again, if that's incorrect, please fix me.
There was a content area that was relating to financial aspects and billing in the past content outline, as well as in this one. But, and again, I can't speak from personal experience in looking at questions, but just the idea that more genetic counselors are billing. Genetic counselors in some states can order genetic tests. We have to know more about how those things are billed and how they're reimbursed and what amounts patients are going to pay. We have to know more about that. And so that's going to be reflected in the practice analysis and how people answered, and then that's going to be reflected in the content outline and then the exam as well. So any of those changes are related directly with practice changes too. But there wasn't a financial reimbursement component last time too.
Okay.
Whether there may be more questions, I can't remember what the exact weighting was then versus now, but there definitely have been. But I'm, just from seeing how practices change, there's definitely more genetic counselors involved in those areas, especially as more genetic counselors get credentialed and can bill on their own. So that's a good thing, but then we have to be able to show that we know how to use that skill as a genetic counselor.
Yeah. And speaking of money, I want to say kudos to you guys for reducing the price of the exam, especially in the age of inflation right now. I mean, I was happily surprised when I got, your email blast that now it is $675 instead of $900. So that is a really big drop. And then for people that are taking the exam again, it used to be $800 and now it's $500. So I know from talking to other people that have been part of ABGC over the years that this was something that was a goal for a long time. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of people that are graduating, that money is tight. They haven't gotten that job yet, or they've gotten it, but they haven't gotten their first paycheck. For people to understand, why is the board exam costly in general? Because a lot of people are like, why is there even a charge for this, all this? I think it might be helpful for people to understand like why it's relatively expensive. I mean, we've talked about how many people are involved in this. Are there other things you guys wanted to mention with just the underlying costs, with the administration, the maintenance, other things like that?
Like every step of the process is a cost. So even just the cost of having a test vendor work with us, that's a huge chunk of the cost. And then like Heather said, every time we convene these committees, and we are doing more and more work remotely, but you still sometimes have to get together to have those meetings, and meeting costs are expensive. So anytime you bring people together, there's those costs. What other costs, Heather? I know that there's a huge line item.
Yeah, so it's some of the innovation costs to bring the new exam in-house to ABGC so that we can control our own customer service better. There's upfront costs for that, and then continual maintenance on those. The board, there's many more. It's the cost of doing business to keep the lights on, per se. You could say, like, this is how much it actually costs to keep ABGC afloat as well. I will say the board has made some significant changes with regards to really looking at increasing the equity and access for individuals to take the exam. There was no slight in the fact that we understand that the price was, really hard, and especially if people aren't passing on the first time, we understand that. Also, the board made a significant investment in new technology and innovations that are taking place this year all the way through next year that are going to benefit genetic counselors that are already credentialed versus those that are coming in for the first time. But with those, looking at, the financial state of ABGC, the board felt that it was the right time that, we give back to our potential candidates and our diplomates as well, to reduce the fees. So we're happy to promote that, and we're happy and we're hoping that this alleviates at least one pain for individuals coming into us. And maybe Angie wants to talk a little bit about the DEIJ committee is kind of working on as well with regards to, access for diplomates.
Yeah, so we are working on a scholarship program for people who are sitting for the board exam, and the DEIJ committee is working on what the application for that program will look like. But we know that some people are not covered, their board exam costs are not covered by their employer, and may have a difficult time paying for those costs, especially after paying for the cost of school. So we are we will be launching that scholarship in the upcoming months, so that people do have an option if they are having financial hardship when it comes to being able to pay for the board exam. And it all goes back to equity. We want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to become certified. We luckily had some strong reserves for ABGC, and that's what allowed us to be able to reduce the cost of the exam. We also feel like we know for sure too, as we have more people sitting for the exam and paying those fees, it helps us reduce the cost. When you're a small organization with a few people sitting, you still have to do everything you need to do to make a high quality exam. The more people that are testing, hopefully on just one time, the more income you can generate, whatever that amount is, and that helps too, us be able to lower the cost. But we are committed for sure for equity, and hopefully making it easier for people to sit for the board exam when they are ready to sit for that exam and not have to worry as much about financial considerations. We don't have all the answers or all the solutions, but we want to help where we can.
No, it's wonderful you guys have been able to do this. And Angela, let me know when that application launches, because we'll update the show notes. So people that are listening to this months after, if it's already launched, check out the show notes. It might already be there. And I also want to mention that if you're negotiating a job, part of your negotiation, this is my personal advice, should be, hey, I want you to, or I need you, whatever that phrasing is, to cover my board exam fee, and other types of things. But since we're talking about the boards, the professional status survey, which is basically a survey that genetic counselors fill out every year now. It used to be every couple years. Now it's every year, which is really helpful. I have the 2023 numbers in front of me. I will update it with the 2024 numbers in the show notes. But over half of people got their exam covered by their employer. So I think that's really important for people to not leave out, especially when you're negotiating for your job. I think that's really, really important. And even a small number of people got a raise in salary or promotion after they passed the exam. So that's more relevant if you're already working in the field. And then, all right, you passed, now kind of get that promotion. I was able to negotiate to have my employer cover this. So I'm one of those, success stories in terms of having my employer cover that. So I think that's really, really important there. And I want to make sure I ask before we start wrapping up here and I don't know how much this is public information, but I know it's on people's minds. So I have to ask, how is the passing point determined? Because I remember when I was taking boards and I was like, all right, I'm going through this practicing exam and, all right, this is how I did. Like, would this be considered passing? Like, what is that benchmark for me? Is it a certain number of questions you have to pass, a percentage? Or is it kind of just part of the information that ABGC kind of just has to process on their own that's not public information?
The passing point is set by, so whenever there's a new content outline, we have to establish a new passing point. And so, right, and that's why there's not instant scoring the first time there's an exam for a new content outline, like there was in August
Right.
2023. And so before that exam was even administered, ABGC had convened this passing point committee. And it's, again, like all of our committees, it has a variety of stakeholders. And their role is, once the exam has been taken, they go through and they take the exam themselves and they evaluate with a psychometrician who's also evaluated the questions, the difficulty of each question, and what they think a minimally competent genetic counselor has to know. So it is a group of individuals, peers, that are making these decisions about, what questions, like how many questions do people need to be able to answer correctly in order, and I'm like giving you the very simple explanation, not the psychometric explanation, in order to demonstrate that they're minimally competent. And so they go through that process a couple of times by looking at every single question individually, coming together, and together they set this pass point, and which was a number, and then they bring it to the board, and we decide what the final pass point is. And just based on our accreditation criteria, our pass point has to be within a couple of standard deviations of what theirs is, but we have a little bit of wiggle room if we think it should be lower versus higher. But Heather, do you want to give some more technical background?
Yeah, certainly. So, kind of going back to when we very first were kind of talking about like the test development process and what it takes to go into the exam, and we really talked about getting those groups of individuals together that are fully representative of the community. This is probably one of the most important tasks that the board does every 5 years. So, this is one that is really, really scrutinized. So, we had SMEs that were 1 year out of the exam to 5 years, a couple that were a little out from that. We had educators, clinicians, research, so we had everyone who was in there. And they basically rate what's the probability of a minimally qualified candidate, getting this question right. And they would do it from a percentage basis. So they go through all that. You can imagine going through 170 questions twice, going through these, and then they could debate their ratings and talk about it, because sometimes you're always going to have that one person that thinks everyone should answer every question correct, and then you have that other outlier that thinks, oh, everyone's going to get it wrong, like this is too hard. So they do some debating between them. So there is a very scientific method behind it. It is fully facilitated by our test development team. It is not, or I should say our vendor, it is not facilitated by staff. We have nothing to say with how that happens. It was a great job. I sat in all of them. And the group came together and they were very thoughtful. So like when it comes out and they run the numbers of the individuals that tested, it comes out to say, here's what the group setting says, here's what the passing score would be. And that's when the board can go up or can go down, meaning we lower the pass rate, we raise the pass rate, type thing. And they do have to stay within those certain deviations in order for accreditation purposes, or else that would then be the board just dictating what the pass rate should be versus what the science is telling us. I know that's not everyone's favorite answer, and I know that the pass rate is significantly different than before, which is also things that we're looking into. I do know, 5 years is a long time between tests. So the general consensus as well of what is expected of a genetic counselor could have shifted in that 5 years. That's also not going to be a popular answer for some people, but we are, we have to see how this kind of plays out. The August exam was obviously difficult. We know that. So we did that fall exam for them again, and then the March one. So we really actually kind of have to see how this August one plays out. There's no longer mitigation factors of people not having confidence in the test center. We're overcoming some of those, and we're certainly trying to, let people know that we're here for them and to support them. But, and unfortunately, we have to stand behind the science as well. So,
yeah,
and certainly. I think because this content outline was so different from the previous content outline, which had basically been pretty similar for a total of 10 years, even though they did it twice, I think that also kind of took people, like, they weren't expecting that change. So I think we're hopeful that in August this time, because people have had time to really digest that new content outline, to talk to colleagues about what that actually means. I mean, I know it, me as a program director, I'm always looking at it and thinking, like, what does this mean? How does it map back to the things we were already teaching? Is there anything missing? We're hoping that that test rate will go up, but we don't have any guarantees. In other, so oftentimes it does, like the first time you take an
Yes.
exam, it's often a lot lower, and then the March exam, which is usually the February exam, sometimes the scores overall have been a little bit lower than the August one. So we're hopeful that it'll go up now that people are more familiar. But fingers crossed, because we understand the implications when somebody doesn't pass, and it's never our intent to make an exam that is so difficult that it more difficult than it has to be. But we also have to follow the science and our subject matter experts and our psychometricians, and use the scoring that demonstrates minimal competence, just because this is a high stakes exam and a lot of people are depending on the fact that whomever passes really is qualified to be a genetic counselor.
That's what it all comes back to. I think we need to make sure that we have that standard, because as you said, it's not just being a certified genetic counselor, it's also all the states that license based on you being a certified genetic counselor, meaning passing the exam. I have so many questions, but I think I'm just going to end with this one if we have a moment. Over the years, the way that test takers have found out if they've passed or not has changed. So I know in the OG days, you'd have to wait and get that letter in the mail. Then there were days of your program director would find out and tell you. In my experience in 2020, it came up on the screen. Congrats, you passed. I did a crazy happy dance. I'm sure I was quite a sight, and that H&R Block. So how has this changed? I know in March, from what I heard from my students, was that they did have to wait a little bit, which makes sense because you were kind of, figuring things out. For people taking in August or beyond, how will they be finding out? What does that look like?
So the March candidates actually got immediate scoring. So
they did. Sorry, I'm forgetting. I'm thinking maybe the previous
August. Yeah, August was not.
Okay.
Yep.
The August ones had to wait the 6 to 8 weeks because we had to do the standard setting. So everyone had to test.
Right.
We had to get the stats. But so good to know. Job analysis happens every 5 years unless there's significant changes in the industry, and you have to do one sooner. So now the candidates as well will see the screen. They'll see pass fail, and then within an hour, the diagnostic score report is emailed directly to them, so they have access to that. And so we're super happy about that. And that's the same process whether you take it remote proctored or at a test center. So you don't actually leave with a paper copy at that day, but and then it gets emailed directly to you. So
that's all that matters. We don't need a paper copy that day. If you know you passed or didn't, that's what to know that day. Yeah.
I would be the same. I would be the same thing. And just a little plug. I know we're really running out of time, but I'm really, one thing we weren't able to cover here, which is a super advantage for the individuals that are starting to apply now, is that ABCGN was very thoughtful in the integration for this new application system. So the beauty of it is that you apply, you pay, and you schedule directly through the application system. It is fully integrated with Prometric. It's amazing. It's a one-stop shop. You don't have to leave the site. You can reschedule, you can cancel, you can do everything through our portal. It's like your portal now. And I just want to really reiterate that, because it's very helpful for individuals, whether you're getting ADA or you're not getting ADA, it's all in there. So, and then your results will feed immediately back into our portal and update the system. And then you'll either turn into a reapplicant or you're now a diplomate, and your recertification application is already there waiting for you. So maybe we can come on your podcast in the fall, and because we're going to have much more updates on recertification that I think your audience would be very interested in. So we could probably
relevant to me too, right? Because at some point, I guess if I pass in 2020, I'd be recertifying 2025. It's every 5 years.
So it will be very interesting for you. And also, we have a newsletter that's coming out tomorrow too that teases a little bit of this, but certainly we'd love to come back on and share some of those other innovations that are going to make GC's lives easier. So
Ooh, I like to hear that. Anything to make life easier. Definitely.
It's going to. It's going to make your life so much easier. So
Well, any other final thoughts from you, Angela, before we close it out?
No, just thank you for the opportunity. And we welcome any feedback from any candidates, any diplomates who have questions or concerns about the way the exam is administered and developed. And if you ever want to consider being on the committee, we are always looking for committee members. So also consider that opportunity. Volunteers, anybody can apply.
Yeah,
And you'll be
definitely.
getting an email in July for that opportunity. So keep your eyes
Amazing.
out on that. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes, and you guys send that out, I think, every year for people listening, years from now. And also, congrats on your new website that just launched in June 2024. So very exciting, kind of a new logo and stuff that you guys probably see for this episode here. But Heather and Angela, thank you so much for being just so transparent. I think this helps ease anxiety of test takers just to know a little bit more about the process. It's also really helpful, I think, for program directors like Angela to understand like how this works, because students will often ask their program directors, hey, like, do you know how this works, how that works? And also for supervisors, a lot of us genetic counselors are supervisors that really want to be helping out our students, our mentees. So I think this is just so helpful, not only for test takers of this year and coming years, but for everybody else that has a part in, those students taking the exam. So thank you so much. And I also just wanted to give a little plug for episode 138. I provided advice with two other genetic counselors. I'm in the prenatal realm, so I had a cancer genetic counselor on and a pediatric genetic counselor. And we talked about just how we all studied for the boards and how that looked different. So just to kind of give you some insight there. And my last plug is that I highly recommend checking out GC Genius for study materials, including the flashcards they have for the top genetic conditions. This is great for any kind of study materials just going into school. If you're somehow listening to this and ahead of the game and you're starting grad school soon. So they just have some awesome study materials, link in the show notes. But thank you again, Heather and Angela. Really appreciate all the insight and your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.
We're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made